Recently, I was thinking about Funimation. Now that the website and the last kind of remnants of the company are now starting to flicker out as the website shuts down, it really made me think back about, the years of looking at Funimation. And, oftentimes there's a few different ways people often look at it. One of the big ones is, some of the big series. This includes Dragon Ball, Yu Yu Hakusho, Fruits Baskets, Full Metal Alchemist, Attack on Titan, Black Clover, and My Hero Academia, to name a few. Another angle which often people reminisce on Funimation is often many of the voice actors who, not only made major careers for themselves, but also were a staple in the anime industry for over, 25 years, such as Christopher Sabat, Sonny Strait, Laura Bailey, Monica Rial, Austin Tittle, among many others. But one of the things that really interests me is somebody that oftentimes doesn't get a lot of attention towards Funimation, which is the founder, Gen Fukunaga. And, for me, for a person that really was, at the top of the pyramid of this, really interesting company, he relatively doesn't have a lot of exposure, which I find to be interesting. Even though he was the executive producer for over 200 movies, TV shows, and arguably thousands of episodes of beloved series, he really was somebody that was very behind the scenes. As far as I'm aware, he never voice acted in anything related to it. And even when it came to public appearances, outside of some high profile movies and San Diego Comic Con appearances and materials specifically related to Dragon Ball, he relatively speaking was not somebody that, appeared on camera very often. And I really thought this would be kind of an interesting thing to look back on this individual and really see, really one of the major reasons why, Funimation as a brand never really faltered that much over its 25-year existence. So let's take a moment to look back and, really look at Gen as, not as just, the man behind the scenes, but really one of the important aspects of, Funimation as a whole. Gen was born in Japan in the early 1960s, but him and his family moved to the United States when he was a very young child. So he essentially was raised mostly in the United States, although he did spend a little bit of time during his middle school years in Japan, where he was actually exposed to a lot of Japanese manga and anime as well. Considering the time, he more than likely was exposed to a lot of very popular anime of the early to mid 1970s, which includes such titles as Lupin the Third, Tomorrow's Joe, Tiger Mask, among many, many others. But interestingly enough, he actually would, instead of pursuing anime right away, actually followed in his father's footsteps and actually went to school for electrical engineering, where he ended up getting both a bachelor's and master's. And, interestingly enough, this could have been the end of the story, and he could have easily gone on to be, a very successful engineer in his own right. But he actually had a really strong interest in going into business. Ended up going back to school once again in the late 80s to get an MBA. By now, it was the early 1990s, and Gen was in his early 30s. And he really wanted to pursue something that, it was always a passion of his, but he finally had the knowledge base to do it, which was to bring anime to the US market. And the thing is that, anime had been coming over here, over the decades, but nothing had really taken off that much. And there were a handful of companies that were starting to dabble in it, but nothing really that major. And his goal was not only to just bring over anime, but he wanted to bring over the best of the best. And luckily, he actually had a connection into the anime scene through his uncle, who at the time worked for Toei, working in the live action industry, working on such titles as Power Rangers and Kamen Rider. Though it should be noted that just because he had a connection into the Japanese scene doesn't mean necessarily he had a right to these titles as well. Especially considering Dragon Ball, even at the time, was considered to be one of the crown jewel of the anime industry. And it actually took years of convincing on the Japanese side of things to allow a relatively newcomer to have such a important title. But after many years, they did come to an agreement with it. which actually required Gen to actually work with a close family friend for seed capital to acquire such a monumental title, which by today's standards would have been over $2 million. But with this, he was able to form what would become known as Funimation in 1994. At the same time that he was trying to acquire the rights to Dragon Ball, Gen also was at trying to deal with the American distribution end of the spectrum, going to Hollywood and speaking with many movers and shakers, trying to essentially get Dragon Ball on television to get more eyes on it. And unfortunately, he pretty much had the door slammed in his face in many different regards. Many producers at the time believed that having a serialized children's show was completely unheard of and would not work in the Western market, as well as the fact that Goku and a lot of the other aspects of the show were very untraditional, and did not really get a whole lot of help on that end. Fortunately, he actually had some good advice from Hayam Saban, who was another licensor of Japanese and foreign materials, and actually convinced him to, instead of trying to get something on a much larger scale, work with local broadcasters on a station by station level to get content on the air for Saturday, Sunday, and after school programming. Even though Dragon Ball was finally making it on television at this point, it was very much met with lukewarm success, and this would continue for several years. And until a little network called Cartoon Network, Toonami Block came along in the late 1990s. This is where things started to be a big game changer, where it really ended up getting the eyes and attention of a lot of children and really became a staple for not only Funimation, but Toonami as a whole. From here, things would definitely take an upturn swing for not only Funimation, but the industry as a whole. Now that Funimation was starting to see some traction, Gen started to pursue what his original goal was, which was to license successfully proven popular anime. And the first two series that he licensed after Dragon Ball was Yu Yu Hakusho and Fruits Baskets. Arguably two series that would go on to be very popular as well. At this point in history, too, there actually were several other anime companies that were also licensing anime and manga in the Western space. Most notably, there was ADV, Viz, Media, as well as Pioneer and Genion. Were all starting to see that anime was starting to become a very profitable product. One thing that actually really separated Funimation in particular from a lot of its competitors was the fact that Gen was a very conservative businessman when it came to licensing anime, and he tried to, for the most part, stick to his principles of which were trying to license anime that had a track record. So one of the big ones being, was this an adaptation of a manga, which ended up being a really major factor of if the manga was successful, more than likely the anime was also going to be pretty successful as well, with a lot of original series not really having a large track record of successes, even though there are many cases of this, like Cowboy Bebop and Evangelion, to name a handful. One of the other things that he also really tried to stay away from was series that historically did not really perform very well in the market. This primarily involved sports series, anime specifically related to historical events or period pieces, and idol series as well, which, as much as these series were very popular overseas, they just never really had as big of a niche for most of Funimation's run. A great example of this is pursuing titles such as Full Metal Alchemist, which were very action heavy, became a very popular title on Toonami, and ended up paying off major dividends for Funimation, especially in the early 2000s. Another thing that really separated Funimation from a lot of the other companies that were releasing at the time was the fact that, again, kept things very simple in the sense that there wasn't really a whole lot of gimmicky aspects to purchasing anime, especially from Funimation. Whereas a lot of other companies like ADV did these kind of ridiculous box sets that were giant and ate up a lot of space. Relatively speaking, they kept things very simple, yet at the same time providing really high quality DVD and later Blu-ray releases with really integrated menus and making a very high quality product for the time, which was really something that later fans, especially collectors, would really go on to appreciate. At the same time, Gen was also experimenting with different aspects of media that were also happening at the time in a pre-streaming era, such as creating a linear Funimation channel in some markets, as well as Funimation on Demand, which had some limited levels of success, but once again also allowed a lot of anime fans to be exposed to things that were not just primarily on Toonami. But as Funimation continued to license anime in the 2000s, it was becoming very clear that competition was becoming much more fierce, and margins for profit were getting much and much thinner. And it was kind of seen by Gen through some modeling and projections that uh, DVDs and Blu-rays were reaching a point of peak during this period of time. And this was when Funimation was being put on the market for the first time to be sold. In 2005, Funimation would be sold to a distribution company called Novar, and Gen would continue on as an executive producer as he always had, mostly because the deal was set up in a way that was very advantageous for him. Although the same could not be said for the rest of the entertainment industry at the time. As some people may be aware, in 2008 2009 was a major recession, which ended up leading to a lot of problems in the industry with massive amounts of shrinkage, especially in the entertainment industry. Although I will say that for again, he ended up taking a pretty good golden parachute, uh, allegedly receiving over $100 million to in the sale of Funimation. It should also be noted that at this time, many other anime companies during the 08-09 recession unfortunately went out of business, most notably ADV Films, in which Funimation actually ended up acquiring a lot of their works, especially the ones that were half complete on sale, which ended up being quite an interesting acquisition at the time. Two things that I should also note about the late 2000s is that Funimation, one was that they started to pursue films and movies, which really was a space that had not really been tackled that much outside of the Dragon Ball films, which was a pretty big step forward. The other being that Funimation also started to put a lot more emphasis on their online website, which was really starting to pick up steam, especially as streaming and other services started to become much more popular and feasible. It should also be noted that at this time, the Navarre company also was starting to see a lot of issues. Once again, with Gen selling Funimation at its peak, they also started to see the fact that DVD and Blu-ray sales were starting to see a bit of a downturn, and ultimately the shareholders of the Navarre company really wanted to sell Funimation. And interestingly enough, Gen and a few others were in a great position to actually buy the company back out from them, which really is relatively unheard of. And interestingly enough, they ended up buying it back for about one fifth of what Funimation was originally sold for, which was about $20 million to buy it back. So ultimately ended up playing a big role in Gen's favor, as well as it also left Funimation in a much better position than many of the other anime licensors at the time. But even though Funimation was starting off on better footing, that doesn't mean necessarily it was smooth sailing. During the same period of time, there was a little streaming company called Crunchyroll, was slowly kind of making its way up through the ranks. Originally starting off as a piracy website, ended up getting venture capital and was slowly but surely becoming a major force in the streaming realm. To kind of counteract this, Funimation also released a official streaming app for their own services, as well as attempted to close the gap between licensing titles and releasing them for the English-speaking market. Arguably, one of the biggest cases of this is the show Space Dandy, which was not only simuldubbed but also released on American television before Japan, which was completely unheard of. But once again, it also showed the trailblazing nature that is Funimation and at the time. One of the other aspects that also a lot of people don't really talk about is the fact that, Funimation also tried to align itself with other streaming networks to also spread its titles as far and wide as into many people's hands as possible. Arguably, one of the best cases of this is actually they had a really major deal with Hulu where a lot of their bigger titles also would get on there, which really kind of expanded far beyond just linear television. The other major thing is that to also still be competitive in the market, they also started to make a lot of deals with Universal Studios, which allowed them to keep their prices inflated in stores for physical releases, but also allowed them a lot of other opportunities that normally would not have been available. But as time kind of went on, this also started to be a bit of a problem also for Gen, in the sense that a lot of the things that had originally made Funimation very successful with the wait and see model started to see a lot of cracks, in the sense that now competition was getting very fierce with not only having to face against Crunchyroll, but also Netflix and Amazon were also entering the space with basically dump trucks full of money. And basically, to counteract this, Funimation ultimately ended up making a partnership with Crunchyroll, which at very first was very symbiotic, in the sense of Funimation would essentially dub these anime and have at least original streaming rights for a lot of these shows, with Crunchyroll getting them after a slight delay. Funimation would also be in charge of dealing with the physical distribution of these titles as well. But once again, Gen was starting to kind of see the writing on the wall in the mid 2010s, with the fact that streaming had completely changed the market, and it was becoming increasingly obvious that the role which Funimation originally played was starting to become a little bit difficult to function in this new world. And it became apparent, especially after Sony had purchased Crunchyroll, that it was time to sell the farm, essentially. And in the late 2010s, Crunchyroll and Funimation came with an agreement to merge, with Funimation becoming a subsidiary of Crunchyroll, eventually getting absorbed in. Gen would continue on for another 2 years before stepping down in 2019. Gen would ultimately end up leaving Funimation with a fairly large sum of money, to say the least. But things were a little different for the original Funimation studios. Although the studio for dubbing continues to this day, most of the other aspects of the of Funimation have shut down and have been moved essentially to the California base, if not scuttled completely, which definitely was kind of an interesting aspect for a lot of fans. My final thoughts on Funimation as a whole is that, Gen managed to accomplish a lot in his, 25 years of running the company. And one of the big ones is the fact that, he ended up accomplishing his ultimate goal, which was to bring over very popular, high quality anime to the American market, and really expand its from this niche sub hobby of cartoons and comic books into being a much larger component. And it really is a big thing to say, especially how much passion, especially a lot of older fans have for Funimation, with having such high quality standards for the industry, and become making a lot of people lifelong fans of this, and even in some people passing this along to their children or their cousins or any other relative, which is something that you don't often see. And the thing is that some aspects of it was hard work and determination to build Funimation, but also just having the luck of buying and selling at the right time. And I think it's important that people kind of see that as much as it is sad to see like a company that really meant a lot to a lot of fans, even going back to the 90s, ultimately this is pretty much the best case scenario that could have happened for Funimation. And I do really wish again a lot of luck in the future, and the fact that he really left his mark on this fandom far beyond just the voice actors and the anime that was brought behind it. And I think that's a lot to say for Funimation, to say the least. So thank you for everyone who watched this to the very end. Really, is appreciated. And like and subscribe if you liked my content. If you have any comments on Funimation or Gen, to say the least, that I may have missed or overlooked, please leave a comment below and look out for my next video.